Hello and welcome to the Luxury Living Podcast. On the Luxury Living Podcast, we explore ideas and thoughts that are all around the things you need to do to live in an automated and fabulous luxury home. If this is the first time you've found the podcast, welcome. There are plenty more like it. If you go to YouTube and look for the Bravas Luxury Living Podcast. If you like it, put a thumbs up. That would help us a lot. Share this. And if you bookmark and press the bell thing, when more luxury living podcasts come up, you'll get to find out what they are and enjoy them as they come out. I do these podcasts with a colleague of mine, Keith Brown from Dallas. Hey, Keith, how are you?
I'm fantastic. I woke up today and it wasn't 100 degrees, so
That's
it's a great
great.
day.
Well, that's a fabulous way to start the day. This week, Keith, rather than necessarily go into a product, we're going to talk about the ideas of how you might budget for this. You're someone who spends a lot of time with our customers. Is this a difficult conversation for them to have?
It is a difficult conversation for them to have. I think most of our clients are used to having some control over the conversations they have, and a lot of them come into this with really no knowledge of what they're going to be asked to spend and what their options are. I think it's a really constructive, helpful conversation to have, but it can be tough.
Okay, well, to have this conversation with us, it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Roach. Kevin is a friend to the podcast. Thank you for joining us again, Kevin.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Nigel. Great to join you today.
Yeah, so Kevin, this is one of those things we all discuss and debate a lot between us. So I want to start a really, really high level. Why is this an important conversation for whether it's a builder or a homeowner or someone to have? Why is this such an important conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And frankly, it's probably one that we get asked most frequently, right? Is why do I need to start this now? And it's because there is such a huge span of how much you can do in your home from a technology standpoint. There's an education process that it takes to go through in order to learn about all the different options that are available to them. And it can be something that adds quite a bit of cost to your build. And so knowing that ahead of time and really being able to evaluate what are the most important technologies and benefits to your home that can go into it is really smart to jump on early in the process.
But it might be a bit self-serving for someone at Bravas to say, don't spend too little. But there is a dramatic difference, isn't there, between what somebody will spend on their own doing this yourself and what someone like Bravas will do for you. How do you characterize that big difference?
Yeah, that's a great point. And really, I think when you look at that, there are a couple different factors that go into it. Obviously, you've got kind of level of the quality of the product that you look at. And you also have the ability, the knowledge of actually having to go do it yourself, right? Being in the technology business, I always kind of laugh. My wife, if we have an issue or if something comes up with technology, you're the person who has to be the one to actually fix all that. And there are some great do-it-yourself products that are on the market, but they don't hold necessarily the reliability, maybe the performance or the design elements that are available. And when you've been dreaming of building a custom home, for several years and looking at how do you actually want this all to go together, knowing or being educated and knowledgeable about what's available to you is really important. And you may end up finding out that, hey, I'm okay going back to a do-it-yourself product. But in all likelihood, once you've learned the different possibilities, you're probably going to be looking at something that may fit into more of the design elements and the features of the home, or ways to actually hide and conceal that technology so that you focus on the things that really matter in the house, or the other items that are important.
I always think there's a scale thing as well. When I do something myself, I do one plug, I do one room, I do one light. We talk about doing whole homes, aren't we? And so if you approach it from a whole home, DIY could be a pretty huge project for someone.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can think about something as simple as maybe having some automated light switches, right? You take some of these larger custom homes and you may have 150, 250 lighting loads that go into a house, and having to do all of that yourself tends to become a little overwhelming. And having a professional that can stand behind that, whether that be Bravas or anybody else, is obviously very important. They're able to manage that the right way. They're able to talk to different contractors that interface with those kind of things throughout the build process. and ensure that it's done appropriately to code, and in a way that really adds the value to your home and to your lifestyle.
So talking about that scale that you can't do it yourself, when somebody does make a decision about their budget, like do I want to have shades or do I want to have lighting control, they can make a huge difference in the overall price of their home. How do you start to have that conversation where they can help decide what's important to them and what they want, but also balance that with that kind of question of, well, of course I want that. How much does that cost?
Yeah. I always kind of fall back to my wife was a school teacher, and she always kind of told me that people learn in different ways. And when we start talking about um, items that people aren't necessarily always are familiar with, and in this situation, technology, that it starts with an education and really an understanding of what's happening with technology in the industry, what different pockets of items that go into it. You mentioned shades as kind of an example. Maybe it's security or surveillance that's very important to a family. It may even be something about access control. Maybe you don't ever want to have to carry a key again. And you start to identify all these different things. And one, you have to be educated to it, right? So being knowledgeable about what's available to you. And then the second part is to really understand the differences as you go through them. You know, if we're sticking with shades, for example, you may find something that's a very inexpensive shade that you find from Home Depot or 30-minute blinds or whatever they call those places now. And those are absolutely options for giving you an automated window treatment, but it won't necessarily give you the elegance and the beauty or the fabric selections that you might get.
Like you said, quality of the products is one way they can drive the price, but it's also just educating them on like what something is actually doing for them. Like for example, in a motorized shade, a client might think I want motorized shades on every single window. But when you find out that they have a completely private north facing yard, you can kind of educate them on why that maybe is an easy place for them to save money. They don't need the privacy. They don't need the lighting control necessarily. Um, what are some other ways you find that you can kind of have those conversations with the client to steer them in the right direction before you really fully understand what their budget is?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. And you're absolutely right. When we talk about these different technologies, the underlying element to this is that these items are supposed to make living in these custom homes more enjoyable, right? We take something that's can be fairly complex, and we're trying to find a way to add value to how people live. And whether it's the ability to have privacy through these window treatments or possibly even blackout shades in bedrooms. Another example of that might be in lighting controls, where we say, you have these guest bedroom suites. A lot of people build homes, these larger homes, and they may have 5 or 6 bedrooms, and half of those are never used. And so we don't have to worry about having lighting control in there or spending the money on that because one, they don't get used, and so they're never being left on. It might be something where we pick or highlight the most important areas for music, for example, and say these are the areas that we're living in, and it's so important for us to have that experience in these spaces. But I'm not necessarily worried about those in my children's rooms or the guest bedroom or another space like that. And that's a really important aspect of budgeting and being able to figure out what we have.
That's one we've run across a lot. And I'll say the best experiences I've had with a client that says something like, well, yeah, I'd love to just hit a button and turn off all the lights. And then they find out what that's going to cost and they go, okay, well, do I really care about that? It's also great that like we get to partner with them and their design team because we have like architects we work with that are really quick to jump in and say, I definitely think in all of these living spaces, you should have lighting control, but in the guest bedrooms and the kids' bedrooms upstairs, it's probably not that important. And we do this all the time. And we work with Bravas all the time. And people are really happy with this overall outcome. But just getting to be a part of their team and be an advisor to them. I think that's one of the things that a lot of clients put up their guard on is they assume if they tell us their budget, we're just going to try to spend it all. And they kind of hold back from that. How do you start to have those conversations to get an idea of the client's budget without just coming out and saying, what's your budget? Because obviously that could put a client on guard.
Yeah, I usually never start with the budget question. I typically will start with letting them experience or see different technologies that are available. And that might include, a client coming into our office and going through kind of our experience center that we have here. Or it may just be something where I pull up an iPad app and I show them different technologies that are available to them so they can kind of see what those look like and how they function. And so it's getting a knowledge base together, and then really asking smart questions, right? Let's talk to them. Do they travel all the time? Are they expecting more children? Is it something where their work habits keep them out all day and they're coming home at night when it's dark? And so it's figuring out what their lifestyle is like, and recommending the technologies that are appropriate for their lifestyle. And on top of that, depending on if we start to bump into a budget, the top end of a budget, or exceed a budget, then it's educating them on how do we build a structure that's scalable and that can modify as their life changes moving forward, so that we have the correct infrastructure that's in place, to build off of and to really adapt as their lives change.
So before we get to the end of this podcast, I'm going to torture you for a percent number, but we'll hold everybody in suspense to keep them here. But I do want to know, does it matter when you start this process with a client? Because my guess is the earlier, the better.
Yeah. I have a great builder we do a lot of work with here in town, and he actually says the three people he wishes his clients would talk to early in the process are technology consultants, as one, landscape consultants as a second one, and then ultimately, this is kind of strange, but roofing material is a third. I guess he tells me that tile roofs are very expensive. I don't have one in my home, so I have no idea. But he says those three contractors can have an enormous range of what costs can be, based on all the reasons we're talking about. How far do we go? What technologies do we adopt and put into them? And the earlier we can get in on these conversations, and I'll say as early as even maybe before you've even really picked out an architect or a builder to start working with, coming in and being educated and knowledgeable about what you want. Oftentimes we look at different cars and what maybe our next vehicle might be before we're in a position where we actually need to go buy a vehicle. We're educating ourselves on that, and we're looking at what those might be. Or maybe different vacation options, right? And so you're thinking about these things all the time. And similarly, I feel like the earlier we can start talking about technology, being educated on it, and knowledgeable about how that fits into your build, the better it is and the better experience you'll find.
And I want to push that point a bit with you, Kevin, because, refurbs are a different thing because walls exist, floors exist. But in building a new home, when we say earlier, you mean before the walls are up and the things are installed and you're having to drill and scrape and rebuild, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Yeah. For a new construction, we're talking about as you start to sketch out what this house might look like, or if you have in your mind that this is what I want to do, and you're down to a couple architects that you're trying to decide on, the ability to come in and look at what technology fits into that, or what kind of lighting, possibly fixtures or controls fit into that, I think that's an absolutely operable time to get in and start working on that. I would say you even want to have most of your decisions made and your budget set before the framing actually starts to go up, because there's just a lot of details depending on which technologies you've chosen to adopt into your build, that need to be ironed out early on in the process. And the earlier you do that, the more smooth your build will go. The less cost overruns will come about throughout the build, you'll have your budget already set, so you kind of know where you are on things.
And my experience is also the longer you wait, the less you're going to get for your money. Because if we have to do work to replace or drill or cut or carve, that's money you could have spent on the home technology. So the longer you wait, not only is it more difficult, you actually probably get less for the money as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You take something as simple as wiring a TV during construction, right? During the framing stage of construction, or mechanical phase, we call it. You may pay a couple $100 to have a TV wired somewhere, but to come back in down the road and add in a TV that you forgot to add on your patio before you finish and move into your house, that's going to cost you a couple $1,000s maybe by the time that you actually run the wire and patch it and do all the stuff that goes to it. And that holds true across the board, right? So as we talk about lighting controls and how that scales, and we can really maximize how that works depending on which technology we go to, or possibly even motorized window treatments, the ability to really figure out how the framing works so that we can fit pockets in so that it looks concealed in a way. We don't have to worry about the cost of a fascia or a covering that goes to it.
And there'll be a big difference between a wired shade and a battery shade. So
Absolutely.
Battery shades are very efficient and very quiet. But changing the batteries when the thing's 16 feet off the ground is a complicated problem for people.
That's
Even more
right.
so than that, you can't hide a battery shade the way you can hide a wired shade. And what he was mentioning, like reframing a house, we have jobs where we come in too late and the client says, well, I want this shade completely hidden up in the ceiling. And that's not really an option without doing some major reframing if they didn't plan for it in the first place. Sometimes it's not an option at all within any reasonable budget. And so when Nigel mentions not getting as much for your money, like that is absolutely one of those places. Another one that I think of is those nice boxes we have, the recessed TV boxes that go in the wall. I mean, they have to go exactly where you want that TV to end up with no real fudge factor either way. And if you frame the house without even thinking about that, well, if you want it centered on a room or centered on a fan, you may have to then come back in and move a stud to get it in there where you could have just had that conversation prior to framing and been ready to move on a day earlier.
That's right. Yeah, and I'm a stickler for how linear things need to be in a home, and so I tend to look up at the ceiling more than anybody else does, and I guess it's just a product of being in this industry. But I think things should be absolutely perfect, right? There's no reason that we come in later and have to put a speaker in when we could have actually had a pre-construction ring that went in the ceiling to make sure that everything was perfectly in alignment and that there is no misses on that. And it doesn't cost more. It actually costs less because we have a pre-construction ring, so the installation goes faster, and it's perfect. There is no misstep there, and we get that luxury when we're brought in early to be able to do that, and not later in the process.
And I've seen some of the homes you do, Kevin, and they're beautifully aligned. And you like, square lights and square speakers and round lights and round speakers. And I think sometimes people think when we bring these up, we're trying to sell them something, and because they're naturally suspicious of salespeople. But it's really not. There's a design aesthetic that you try and get from the client. And I think you try and project those into your proposals, don't you?
Absolutely. I think that when I really look at the build process, and specifically a lot of the homes we work on, these are dreams of our clients. They've been thinking about this home and the design to it and the architecture of it for years. And if we aren't mindful of what that vision looked like as we implement the technology that goes into it, it will really, it has the opportunity to really detract from what their vision was of it. And I think the more we can really show how technology is a complement to a home, and the ability to make that blend in those spaces really helps. And, since this is the budgeting podcast, sometimes those elements can really add cost to your home. And we might say, hey, this dining room has this incredibly, intricate, detailed coffered ceiling with, a hand painted mural on the ceiling, and we don't actually want to see any holes for lights or speakers or any of that kind of stuff. We want this to be a very traditional look. And so if I don't educate a client on an invisible speaker and the ability to have music in that space because they love to have dinner parties, right? But maintaining the aesthetic of the home, then I've done a disservice to that client. And I don't want to push technologies on people. I just want them to pick what's available to them and to be knowledgeable of what that looks like.
I think a great example of that is the speakers you just mentioned, because I think a lot of clients would assume that if we're trying to sell them a more expensive speaker, we're just trying to sell them a louder speaker or a better quality speaker and that they won't notice the difference. But a lot of times we're asking those questions because we want to understand, is the way it looks important to you? Because when we drive speaker prices up, it tends to be to a speaker that's going to look nicer or not be seen at all, not just sound nicer. And that, I think, is one of the reasons those conversations you're having are so important, because it isn't trying to figure out how much the client's willing to spend. It's trying to figure out what will actually make them enjoy the home more, and then giving them a realistic idea of what that would cost. And then, like you said, if that's not in the budget, helping them understand how they can get back within a budget they're happy with without giving up things that are going to meaningfully impact the way they enjoy the home, or things that they could easily upgrade down the road, while making sure the infrastructure's in there. And this was a long way to get to the infrastructure question because, as you've said, clients have the ability to drive the budget a lot. But they can't drive it to zero because there are things you're just going to always do that are kind of the table stakes for their budget. Can you kind of explain real quickly, like what things fall in that category and why they're important?
Yeah, there's always foundational items that every home needs now. Part of it is just, infrastructure wiring that goes in place. Obviously, the further we progress into technology, the more wireless products become available. But ultimately, depending on the size and the scale of a house, or even the construction materials that go into it, you are going to require a little bit of infrastructure to make sure all that goes together. And so we have some hard costs from a wiring perspective, a security system, kind of layered off of that, having Wi-Fi and access points across the house. And then we get into some of the actual things that we have to install at the end, right? And in Houston, as hot as it is, and humid as it is, I always tell people the second most important utility we have next to AC is our Wi-Fi. It's more important than television and other things like that we have. And ultimately, you're going to need some sort of a network that goes across the house, especially with how many wirelessly connected devices and appliances and toys and other things that are around now. You need a good network as a backbone. The other thing is that depending on your environment, wherever you are in the US, we want to make sure that we create a stable power environment for our homes. And so, and we're limited to the environmental area that we're in. And, in Houston specifically, we have a lot of rolling power things. And so there's a lot of stuff where power jumps up to 123, 125 volts of power and then down to 117, 116. And we have to make sure we smooth that out, because whatever you buy that sits on that, we want to make sure that it doesn't have issues with it. And so we create stable platforms for that kind of stuff. And so those are sometimes some hard cost items that you kind of need to make sure you have from a budget perspective. And then you can kind of build off of that with the fun stuff after it.
I want to go back to the networking thing. I think the power is very important, and I think people understand, UPSs, and they understand things. But I know clients who said, well, but I can buy a router for $99 from Best Buy. Why am I spending $1,000 to $3,000 putting an enterprise class network in? And I think it's not obvious that almost everything in an automated home uses some form of networking, doesn't it?
Yeah. And not only does all the automated home stuff use some of the network, but everything else we have now, all of our phones, most appliances, generators, everything connects wirelessly to the system. And I think the biggest part that happens with that is that most do-it-yourself or readily available products that are either at like a Best Buy or an Amazon or some local kind of company that you're buying, they're made to connect 3, maybe 4 devices simultaneously. And then they're rotating those through and dropping one off and picking it back up and dropping something else back off with it. And we want to make sure that we have networks that are put together that really allow all your devices to stay connected. And the simplest way I can kind of explain that is if you ever had a wireless printer and you go to print and it's offline and you can't get your paper to come out. I mean, I rarely print anymore. But when I do, I expect it to print, right? I don't want to have to go reconnect my printer that sits in a cabinet on the floor underneath a space behind closed doors and have to re-sign it into my Wi-Fi to make sure it's coming back out. We want those things to function and those things to work appropriately all the time.
And you may have your critical life safety systems on this network as well, and you don't want those interrupted because little Jimmy is playing, an online game. And a sophisticated network, and sort of the networks that we can provide, will actually allow to separate those things out. So your critical systems aren't affected by everybody streaming Netflix at the same time. It's things like that as well, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. I watch my kids now. They play video games on a TV, hold a tablet in their hand, streaming YouTube videos about the game they're actually playing. And I watch just the media consumption, the amount of bandwidth that goes into all those devices all the time. And you're right. Sometimes we just want to make sure our security system's actually functional, or maybe that the Zoom call or the work call that you're going on or that you're about to start is not going to get interrupted because your bandwidth was consumed by other things that aren't nearly as important. And so we can prioritize those items and really make sure that we have that lined up appropriately.
Is there a size of house where this makes sense or where it doesn't make sense? Is there a difference in these decisions in terms of both infrastructure and home automation in big versus little homes?
In my opinion, not really. I've seen small homes have as much technology as the large homes do, typically you may have the same technologies all involved in it. You just may have more of those in a larger home. You may have more rooms of music as compared to a smaller home or a condo or an apartment or something like that. And so as the home size grows larger, there's certainly aspects of things that make sense for the larger home to adopt. Things like maybe lighting control is more important, or notifications of doors being left unlocked or open. It makes more sense that you're not having to run through the home at night trying to make sure all those things are closed and working and tracked down an open zone somewhere. And that may not be as important in a small home where you have a couple doors, right? But a lot of times we find that the same technologies are involved in both of those. You're still going to have your security system. You're still going to have some music. You're still going to have TV. You're still going to have network. You're still going to have maybe control of an intercom, or a surveillance camera or something like that, or a thermostat. And so those items still maintain the same controls. You just may have a few more of those in a larger home than you do in a smaller one.
And building on that, no one buying or building an 8,500 square foot house is going to assume they could go get just the same air conditioner that's in a 800 square foot townhouse and it's going to work and cool the whole house the same way. Like, there are just different infrastructure requirements when you're in a bigger home or when your expectations are increased. And I would say we have clients that spend more on, countertops than they spend on their first home. Their expectations are very different. And for us to deliver something that is robust and performs exactly the way they want to every day and works exactly the way they would expect it to, like your wireless printer that you just hit the button and hope it prints. We're trying to build systems that our clients don't hope work. They know they're going to work. And that does involve infrastructure, and it involves a budget that's reasonable for their expectations. I think maybe that's one of the most important things to get to is, like you said, understanding what the client wants it to do, and then us being able to translate that into a system and a budget that's going to, that matrix is all going to work together where it matches their expectations, it matches their budget, and we know that it can perform the way we want it to.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a client meeting the other day with the client, and all he cared about was not ever having to carry a key for his home anymore. He's like, I've got a car that I just walk into, and it's got a proximity sensor, and I go into my office, I never have a key. And he's like, I don't want my home to have that. I just want it to be like everything else in my life. And so, that doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money, but it does take planning and getting in early on that process and going through that and thinking through what that looks like and how does that work. So
now there are some big ticket items that can really change the budget, aren't they? Let's think of the 2 or 3 things you could do to really explode your budget, and they give great experience, but they'll add a lot. What would some of those things be?
Yeah, a great audio experience, right? Sometimes a great listening area might be something that really explodes that. That's kind of the infantile spin. You can go into it at a low price and just watch that just tick up as it goes, as you kind of play with things. I think that's a really big one, and that, like, maybe even like taking that into like a home theater kind of, for example. Another one are design element items. We touched on it briefly earlier. If we've got smaller light fixtures, 1 inch or 2 inch recessed cans, and we want our speakers to look similarly to what those look like in the ceiling, that can be something that starts to add up and starts to go across it. And really, shading, and specifically fabrics for shades, that can really be something that adds up cost for you. Maybe you don't want just a standard kind of roller shade that comes off, but something that has a beautiful weave, a hand woven fabric. And that can be something that is not only unique.
We do some great golfing simulators as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Not only are they expensive, but you need a room for it.
Exactly. So I want to think about, you present your budget, and I'm guessing, if a client's crazy, they go ask somebody else for a budget. And I know one of the things that's very different sometimes between budgets is the amount of labor. The sort of equipment to labor ratio should be a warning sign about something, shouldn't it, for a client? How should they think about that?
Yeah, you definitely want to watch that spectrum, right? Because if there's an old adage, you get what you pay for. So sometimes if you see something where you have a lot of equipment and a very low labor rate, I'd be cautious of that. that typically is going to tell you that they're going to not necessarily take the time to really make sure that they do a quality job installing everything. Because oftentimes we're, in a 9 month to a couple year build, possibly, maybe a little shorter, right? But you're going to be making multiple trips out to that job site, and time is money. And you want that management of that project to be right. And if you see a very low labor cost, that could be something that's very alarming and that you might want to be cognizant of. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you see something where labor is the bulk of your project, well, that doesn't necessarily work that way either. Sometimes you're installing, if a 6.5 inch round speaker in the ceiling, if it's a low cost speaker, it takes the same amount of time as putting in a very high cost speaker. And so you kind of have to weigh that, right? You need to find kind of that middle range out of it. And so that's something to kind of consider as you look at it.
Yeah, I'd say a lot of the worst client experiences we've had, clients reporting back to us about their bad experiences are either that company didn't really know what kind of management a job like this took. They just said, well, it normally takes us this long to install a speaker, so that's what it'll be here. But they were doing invisible speakers across a whole house, which they'd never done before. So they didn't know how to project management or how much labor that would take. And then by the time they're at the end of that job, that company is struggling to make a profit on that job. And a lot of times that comes back into the client's experience. Heck, a lot of times we get those jobs because the company basically said, I can't support this anymore. And then we have to pick up where they left off. And that's an expensive proposition for a client, for another company to come in, learn all about the system, do their due diligence, replace the things that were done poorly. And the client may end up spending more labor on the second install than they would have on the original job, just because it took so much time to piece it all back together and understand what had happened.
I think on the other side of that, though, you've got to look through the quote and say, is everything I asked for in here? Or, are there any surprises coming? Because I think change orders created by a customer or a client or a builder saying, oh, no, I want this as well, is one thing. Change orders by people underbidding is something you do have to be sensitive to, though.
Absolutely. I tell our clients all the time, we are going to design a solution from end to end at the very beginning. And we're going to lay out every part, piece, widget, everything that you absolutely need for the scope of work that we've agreed upon, so that it is encompassing of all those things. We're not going to come back to you later and go, oh, I miscounted my amplifier zones. I need to buy a new amplifier because I did sloppy work. That's not something we're going to do, because we will have checked all that stuff off ahead of time, and we will have made sure that we have everything that we need, because we are so clearly defined and detailed on how we go through that.
We also have a different approach to warranty, don't we? So to talk a bit about, we don't on these podcasts often try and sell too hard Bravas, but I do think our warranty approach is different. And I think that's an important thing for a client to understand as well.
Yeah, there's really two aspects to a warranty. One side of it is, how long is the company you're partnering with going to stand behind the goods and services that they've sold you and are installing for you? And for Bravas, I think we have an incredibly unique and almost unrivaled warranty program. We have a 2-year parts and labor warranty on everything we install, and that's from the date of your move-in. And then we also have a guarantee of service through our service plan programs. And so if you sign up at the time of purchase with either our essential or concierge plan, then it not only does it give you a guarantee on how fast and timely we will service you and some proactive things we do from a monitoring and a support remotely for you, but it will also then increase your 2-year warranty to a 3-year warranty and really make it a comprehensive solution for you once you've moved into the house, knowing that you have peace of mind to have us stand behind everything and not worry about additional costs that will arise later.
So here's the question that we've been dutifully avoiding. I'm about to build a home. You obviously can't give an exact number because you don't know what I'm going to do with that home. But in terms of budgeting, in terms of where should we start thinking in terms of percentage cost in budgeting?
Oh, that's a hard question, right? It really varies, and it varies primarily based off of the cost of do you want higher performance items? How far do we go? And then also, are they more design oriented? Do we want invisibles? Do we want things like that? Do we want just beautiful keypads that sit on a wall and not banks of switches? But at the end of the day, we really need to be able to give a number, right? And you need to have
We do.
something that you can start with.
I'll play a game with you, Kevin, to see if
Yeah.
this helps. Is it 1%, 5%, 10%, 15%, or 25% on the cost of the house?
I would say typically somewhere between 5% on the bottom level up to 15 to 20% on the higher level is what we commonly see. There are certainly outliers to that, but I think that that's probably a pretty standard place to look.
And at that higher level, we're doing high quality cinema, and we're doing audio in every room. So I mean that is a very full solution, isn't it?
Yeah, that's we're talking lighting controls, great audio distribution, beautifully installed TVs, maybe some hidden technology, tying in different aspects of your home, like your garage doors and your gates and your pools and different items like that might come together. A really good surveillance system and security system, and it really can be pretty comprehensive at that point.
Yeah, even lighting fixtures and shades, which is budget that you won't be spending elsewhere. So I guess it isn't just tacked onto the price at that point.
But I didn't want people to go, well, I can have all of that either, for 1%. I mean, you're going to spend, every time we've moved apartment and we put lighting control and shades and blinds and all of that stuff in, it's not unusual for us, even in a small place, to pay 5% again. And that should be a good working start for people, I think.
I think so too. And I think, to your point, the whole point of this podcast is, how early do you get in? When is too early for you to start budgeting on this, right? And I think that's why, as you start to look at this, as you get excited about technology, reach out to a great integration firm to be able to start this conversation so that you can start to wrap your mind around the parts that are important to you and what those costs may be. Use the 5 to 15 to 20% as kind of a springboard to start, and then start diving in and looking at what that looks like and how that will impact your build and the scope of what you're able to put in for your project.
And ask your integrator to walk through every part of the proposal. They've got to be able to tell you how they built that proposal, don't they?
Absolutely. And one of my favorite questions that clients often ask me is, they always say, well, what's the one thing that I'd not put in here, right? What's something I should have done that maybe I'm not doing right now? I always think that that's a really important question to ask as well, because you may have really honed in and focused on 3 or 4 items that were very important to you. And maybe through that conversation, you've missed something else or you didn't make time for it. And so by having that follow-up question, I think that's a really impactful one. And that allows them to really take a step back and say, this is very common. We see people doing automated window treatments and we didn't spend enough time on that. Or maybe we really needed to focus on a light fixture, something that really would give you that impact and that beauty in your home. That's not something you always think about. So I think that's
I would recommend that people go to our website and download our solution guide, because I think that's something they on their own can climb through everything a company like us can do, and shows them the breadth of that. It also shows them in a sort of good, better, best, what might be the difference between 10, 15, or 25% in some of those areas.
Yeah, I would also add that if you're at the 5% plus range for the cost of a multi-million-dollar house, you should not be walking through a proposal necessarily, but you should be seeing a full set of plans, engineering documents. There's a lot that goes into a system that's that costly. And there's a lot of value that we bring by doing the engineering and making sure you're not going to have those surprises at the end of the day. And if a company is trying to charge you, 5, 10, 15%, and they don't have that engineering behind it, you're not getting what you're paying for.
That's right. Yeah, we talked earlier about looking at your bids, really, and diving into them. I always think one of the things you should look for is there should be an item or a line item that says engineering, right? Or, project management, or a miscellaneous parts fee or something like that goes into it. Because there are so many factors that go into making sure that you have this done right, that those are very important details to make sure that it's done appropriately. And it's not just someone who's an enthusiast sitting down and throwing a bunch of parts on a piece of paper to hand to you. I think it's common when you're looking at these kind of proposals that those items would be included in there.
And I'm having some work done in my home by Bravas, and there was on the bottom line, ancillary parts or whatever it was. And I said, what's that? And they went, well, let me tell you all the little bits we need to do to make the rest of it work. Do you really want to sign off all of those? And it's like, no, I got it now. That's, some of this is about making your life as a client easier as well.
Yeah. Most companies aren't going to eat 1% of a $350,000 install. And if they are, they're probably not going to be in business by the time your job is done.
All right, listen, I think that's a lot of great information. Kevin, we played the 3-question game with you before, so I want to ask a different question. Each one of us can answer it. I think we all have home automation in our home. We're going to ignore the networking and power and the infrastructure stuff. We're going to assume we all have the right amount of. So, Kevin, in your home, what is the number one piece of home automation you say, if I only had one thing, what would it be?
Without a doubt, it's lighting control. The ability to manage a home and have it set appropriately and built into your habits, and the comfort and security that comes along with it, it really is second to none for myself and my family. I think lighting control, without a doubt.
I agree. And I would say if you've never experienced it, at least go get some lamp dimmers and go ahead and have that full experience. Like we can help hook you up with kind of the entry level lamp dimmers so you can start to experience it for yourself. But since he stole that one, I will say being able to walk across the entire home and having music playing everywhere is really hard to go back from.
I would tell you that I'm afraid I'm just going to be boring as well. We moved apartment recently from one which had lighting control to one that doesn't. And, shades, automated shades are great in an apartment and all of that. So it's great. The having like 8 switches or 7 switches on a wall and going, well, which one is this? I mean, the having automated lighting control is, once you do that, going back is really very tough.
Yeah. It's like It's like an automatic window in a car, right? You can't imagine going back to rolling down a window once you've experienced it. It's just how it should be.
Exactly. And Bravas is all about how it should be. So I think that's the perfect note to end this on. Listen, Kevin, thank you very much. It was great information there. I'm sure we're going to get lots of questions. And if anybody has questions, they've listened to the podcast, send us an email, add them into the comments, let us know. We'd love to keep this conversation going. So thank you very much.